Hello Scoundrels, welcome back to the Scoundrels Den. I hope you're all doing incredibly well, hope you're having a lovely new year. Today we're going to be doing a tier list. Now I don't expect this tier list to last a huge amount of time. I'm expecting a patch within the next week or so these things will get shuffled, but I thought it was important to do this because obviously with Wukong's release and the kind of the surge of Evelynn mid, you know, there is a reason to rejig this tier list around based on what I've seen in the meta from Emerald and above from my own experiences, but also just watching high elo streams and looking at match replays and all that kind of stuff. All the good stuff that usually goes into a tier list. I'm here with Rupert, who is being a relatively good boy because he just got back from nursery. And if you'd like to join the Scoundrels Den, join myself and Rupert on our adventures, you can join by the subscription button down below. Also, thanks to G2A for sponsoring the channel. Yes, Rupert, that is a microphone, isn't it? And if you touch it, it's going to make horrible noises for everybody listening. Okay, so what we're going to do is, of course, as usual, we are going to go through each of the individual lanes and we're going to go through those tier lists. And again, it is a matter of opinion. You might not feel that it works in your elo. It's kind of based more for Emerald and above, or rather based on Emerald and above. But I do believe that these tier lists should apply to the majority of elos as well. But yes, hopefully it is something that will help you make better decisions in Champion Select, because a lot of games right now in Wild Rift are purely won from Champion Select because there are some ridiculously strong champions in the current meta. Evelynn mid definitely being one of them. So without further ado, let's get into my first lane. As we always, we start from top to bottom, so we're going to go with the Baron lane to begin with. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the Baron lane to begin with. I like to start, as I said, systematically from top to bottom. And if any of you have not seen my tier lists before, we tend to rate our tier lists as follows: S plus to D, S plus being the best, D being the worst, and we rate them from left to right in their respective tiers as best to worst. What I will say is that every single pick that you see on this list will be able to win games, depending on the tier that you're at and the proficiency with the champion that you have. I've known Tryndamere One Tricks to do incredibly well in Wild Rift, even though I don't particularly rate him as a solid pick overall. And what I would say is, if your favourite champion is low down on the tier list, it does not mean that that champion is bad. It just means that the higher elo you go, the more aligned towards kind of like competitive level that you go, you may find that you start to struggle more so than anything else. So let's start off with the top lane. I think Olaf and Camille are the best. I used to have Darius in this tier, but I think people have kind of figured out how to play around Darius now. I certainly have, and I'm sure most of you have as well. And you'll probably note that people like Gragas, Camille, Olaf, they all have good matchups versus Darius, as does Wukong, although Wukong struggles versus some other matchups. And so therefore, Darius is kind of falling off a little bit as more people have figured out how to play against him. I'd then also say that Gragas is an incredibly strong Baron laner. I play Gragas pretty much exclusively in the Baron lane. I think he has some great melee versus melee matchups, especially. His Drunken Rage is an incredibly strong skill. And in that tier, Darius, Fiora, and Akali are all great Baron lane picks, as are Malphite, Garen, and Wukong. I think Wukong is probably best served in jungle or mid. I think his potential is wasted in the Baron lane, and the reason that I say that is I think he's better off with his ability to roam either from the mid lane or to impact the lanes through the jungle. I'm not saying he's a bad champion. Wukong is a decent champion, but I just think in the Baron lane he's slightly less powerful compared to, say, mid or jungle. But Garen and Malphite are both pretty solid picks. I've moved Dr. Mundo up. I'm going to put a caveat on Dr. Mundo here. Like Jax, Yasuo, Nasus, I've even seen some Graves top, which I've seen has gone pretty well. These are all just good picks. Like, they're okay. They'll do fine in their certain scenarios. But I'm putting a caveat with Dr. Mundo. If your enemy team is heavy on the ability power, so they got an Evelynn mid, a Gragas top, potentially an Amumu jungle, then that's where the power of Mundo spikes. He's very good versus AP heavy teams, and so you might find that he's a better pick in certain compositions. As with Malphite, Malphite is better versus all AD comps than maybe this tier list would 100% suggest. In C tier, Singed, Zed, and Jarvan. The problem with Singed is he often requires a lot of time to manipulate waves. He plays a lot around wave manipulation and kind of dragging the game out. And Wild Rift's map, A, isn't big enough, and I don't think the games are long enough to really fully take advantage of what Singed can offer. And Tryndamere. There is nothing that Tryndamere does that someone like Fiora or Camille can't do better. And so therefore, I just don't think Tryndamere is a particularly strong laner right now, and especially because split push win conditions are kind of not as strong as they were. So that is my take on the Baron lane situation as it stands. Let's move on to the jungle. Oh, Rupert's just asking for some more crisps. Okay, Rupert just ditched me because I didn't have any crisps to offer him. Okay, moving into the jungle now. Okay, what I would say is that Lee Sin is undeniably the best jungler in the game still. He's still incredibly strong early game. He pretty much dominates every other jungler. His levels 1 to 9 are probably unmatched by most of the junglers in the game. Lee Sin is very, very, very strong. But Shyvana is good at matching him. Shyvana essentially can counter what he does in the sense that if your lanes are safe, Shyvana is a good counter ganker, but she also farms much quicker than the Lee Sin. And if she can get to the mid game without your game completely falling apart, then Shyvana is going to be a good pick because she really impacts those mid game team fights. Then in the S tier, we have Amumu, Olaf, Vi, and Wukong, all of which are great junglers, all have big impact. They've got great either early game presence like Olaf or like good team fight presence with great ultimates like Amumu, Vi, and Wukong. I'd say then in A tier, Gragas, he's a good jungler, but he's better served in either one of the lanes where his gold income is better. Evelynn, again, is an okay jungler. She's pretty solid. I wouldn't call her S tier, mainly because she's better served in the lane right now. Evelynn, as I'll talk about in a minute, Evelynn mid lane is an absolute plague on Wild Rift and needs to be nuclear bombed out of existence. Graves and Xin Zhao are also perfectly fine junglers. Then you're going down to B tier, where you have the Jax, the Jarvan, the Yi, and the Camille. Camille's okay, but her clear speed's kind of S, so it can be a bit difficult. Hello, Rupert. He's now slamming the door outside. Tryndamere, you might ask why I put Tryndamere in the jungle here. The reason I put Tryndamere here is actually Tryndamere is better in the jungle than he is in the lanes, mainly because he can actually clear relatively quickly, doesn't need a Tiamat, obviously, because you have the cone-shaped basic attack in Wild Rift if you're a melee champion. And several times I've seen Tryndamere's essentially spin over the Dragon Pit and take the dragon for free. So you might find that in your low elo games where the dragons aren't as hotly covered with vision, you might notice that you might be able to get away with a lot of objective takes with Tryndamere for free. And then Mundo and Malphite, they're just not great junglers. I mean, Mundo's okay, but again, thinks better off with a better gold income in one of the side lanes. The reason, honestly, that a lot of the junglers that would be better in League of Legends and not as good as in Wild Rift is because there isn't any jungle items. So jungle items which generally tend to be good value for money because they're really only intended to be picked up by the jungler where the gold income is lower, they don't exist in Wild Rift. So any jungler that would previously have done really, really good with like a Cinderhulk, for instance, in the old League of Legends items, that doesn't really exist anymore. So those junglers have the same gold costs as everybody else on the map, and the gold income is slightly lower for them. Okay, now going over to the mid lane, and I have created a new tier for the mid lane list because Lane Evelynn is absolutely far and away the most disgusting broken thing I've ever seen in my life. The reason that it is just so good is because she is unmatched at level 1 in pushing the wave. So she pushes the wave and no one else, no other mid laners can even remotely touch how good she is at pushing the lane. And then she can run into your jungle and annoy your jungler who probably hasn't even taken their buff by the time that she's cleared that first wave. She can poke pretty much any other matchup out of existence. Her roam potential is absolutely disgusting post 5 because of her ultimate and the fact that she gets the invisibility. She can just go over wards. Evelynn in the lane is an absolute plague on Wild Rift, and she is nutty broken. I'm going to try and make a guide on her, but honestly she'll be nerfed by the time that it's relevant, if I'm completely honest with you. S+, Gragas and Orianna, I think they're the two best non-Evelynn junglers, non-Evelynn mid laners. I think they're both still incredibly popular in high elo. Other than that, some great picks that you can consider: Zed, Ahri, Akali, and Fizz. I've put Fizz slightly higher. I've noticed that as I've gone higher elo, I've seen a lot more Fizz kind of one tricks, and Fizz is quite a powerful champion when played in the right hands. It has a lot of good matchups. So there's a lot of other strong mid laners as well, especially versus Zed, because you can just hop on your stick when he ults you and he won't be able to deal any damage. A tier, Wukong, pretty good in the mid lane, and again he can roam quite easily from mid lane to other lanes and have impact. Twisted Fate, Annie and Aurelion Sol. Down in B tier, Seraphine, Lux, and Malphite. I put Malphite in. I'm seeing a lot more Malphite mid as a specific counter to Zed most of the time, but I am seeing a bit more Malphite mid. I've actually bumped up Ziggs from D tier to C tier. I've seen a few good Zig players that have changed my mind, but I still don't think he's the most impactful mid lane ever. So this is my tier list. Evelynn mid is by far and away the best, but I think Orianna and Gragas are your next best options after that. But obviously you're going to see a lot of Zed and Ahri as well. They're both incredibly strong mid laners in their own right. Alright, now moving on to the Marksman role. And what I would say about the Marksman role is that despite the Jhin nerfs, I think he's quite clearly just the best AD carry in the meta still. I originally had Jhin tied at the top, but I think actually Jhin is still just better than pretty much any other AD carry in the game right now. Kai'Sa and Draven. Kai'Sa is usually the second most picked AD carry at high elo. Draven, if you're a strong and comfortable Draven player, you'll probably see him a little bit more. Misfortune, if you're not a strong Draven player, you'll see high elo AD carries pick Misfortune. Ezreal is still fine. Jinx and Ashe. Jinx, I actually think maybe I'm undervaluing Ashe here. I'm seeing more and more Ashe the higher elo I go, but her laning phase isn't the strongest, but she pairs very well with something like Braum, for instance. I've actually moved Vayne down a tier. I actually think Vayne is pretty bad, honestly. There are not many hyper tanks in the meta, and therefore Vayne kind of loses value in that sense. And they also really gutted her early game. And I think Varus is good with the buffs, but I don't think he's good enough to really touch the majority of the other AD carries. And then, of course, because Twisted Fate is listed as a marksman for some reason, I have to put him in there, but don't play Twisted Fate in the bot lane. Play him in mid most of the time. But I think Jhin is still just the best AD carry in the meta despite the nerfs to him. I don't think they nerfed him in the right way, and I'm expecting that he's going to get hit a little bit harder in the following patches. All right, let's move on to our final tier list, and we are going to look at supports. Okay, let's look at supports now for the support tier list here in January 2021, and not much has changed. Alistar and Janna still remain the best supports in the game. I think it's pretty close between them, primarily because Janna kind of counters Alistar, but Alistar is generally good into pretty much anything. So Alistar still, I think, just edges it for me. I think his engage potential and his ability to carry games in solo queue is that much higher than Janna's, but Janna is still a very high tier support as well. Then followed by Braum and Seraphine. There was a whole host of supports that you could play beyond that. Nami, Sona. Blitzcrank is good into some specific matchups where you're going into an enchanter that doesn't have much presence, so Blitzcrank is still solid in that regard. You're going to have Lux and even Malphite. I've actually seen Malphite support do really well. It's quite difficult to trade with him with his first ability, and then level 5 he has a really strong all-in potential, so I think Malphite support is actually pretty solid. Then Soraka and then Annie. Annie's just a worse version of Malphite support in my opinion. In fact, absolutely just a worse version of Malphite support. At least Malphite can engage without having to sort of make it obvious. He can kind of just press his button, whereas Annie kind of has to walk up to you and cast Tibbers. So yeah, Annie, in my opinion, is just a worse version of Malphite support. And I'm not a big fan of level 5 all-in supports, but Malphite's kind of proving me wrong in that regard. Okay, that is the tier list. I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions in the comments. I know these tier lists generally tend to provoke a lot of discussion. Not everybody agrees, but they're opinions at the end of the day, just based on what I'm seeing and based on what I'm kind of like monitoring through high elo games, especially on EU. But I really don't mind discussion. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Cool. Well, thank you so much. This is the next tier list that I do will probably be following the next patch that Riot releases, which I assume is going to be in around 4 or 5 days time. So this tier list isn't going to last that long, but I thought I had to do it because Evelynn mid was absolutely stomping everybody and people should know about it. And if you're not playing Evelynn mid and you want to climb some elo before reset, play some Evelynn mid. Alright guys, I will see you soon.